Well, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to our sofa session. It's sort of that graveyard shift of a conference, isn't it? And you're probably already just sitting here thinking about what you've just come from and how you put that, and you go, and now I've got to soak in another session. But we're glad that you've turned up because it leaves us less lonely up the front. Ko Derek Wenmoth tōku ingoa, and it's my pleasure to kind of chair the sofa session this afternoon with four people whose background and contribution here will complement each other quite significantly. I'm expecting and hoping, based on their backgrounds. I'm not going to introduce them because I'm going to let them introduce themselves in a moment in response to one question I give. And that'll be the only time where it's kind of person by person, because after that what we're trying to do is to have an opportunity to be a bit more informal and conversational about this big issue, or the question about learning for success. One of the themes of the conference, and it sort of rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? You know, learning for success. And everyone says, yes, I want my child to be successful. I want my class to be successful. I want my school to be successful. But it's actually unpacking, what does it actually mean? What does it look like? How do we measure it? How do we understand that that's a valid way of doing that? And how do we know that our way of doing that might not interfere or interrupt with the other things that are happening? And how do we know that those measures or those approaches that we're using aren't kind of locked in a paradigm from the past and are really have a future focus? So a whole lot of stuff like that we'll look at. I do want to let you know though that there is if you've got a device with you, there is an opportunity to kind of be participants in this. It's very difficult in the time that we've got to fully activate it as a whole thing. So you will be encouraged, and you're quite able, if you wish, to pose a question at some stage, sort of signal, and as a dutiful kind of chair, I'll try and see that. But online, we're using a little app called Slido. And all you need to do is go to www.slido.com and enter that code that you can see, 1757, will take you into the environment where there's a little box that you can add your questions. Now, we're pretty cheapskate, so we haven't for this occasion bought the fully fledged version of this, which will allow you to assess and judge and rank each other's questions and all that sort of thing. It's just a very simple sort of feedback mechanism. There are a couple of polls in there that relate to a couple of the questions, and you can play around with that as well, but it's particularly the questions. I'll be monitoring what comes in up here and hopefully feed that back into our conversation. So we all set? Happy with that format? There are actually seats up the front. I know this is an educational conference and it is customary in education to sit at the back, but I would encourage any of you who feel a little bit more inclined to follow Carolyn's lead here and come up the front, because it may be easier not only to hear but to see that nuance of people's facial expression when you know whether they're telling the truth or not. But with that, I will come back, and just on the screen here is our panel. So you can see them either on the screen there or in real. But I'm just going to pose a question first for our panel, and really just as a broad way of inviting them to kind of introduce themselves and the context or the perspective that they bring to this. And that's just the question really is, we talk about success. What does success in education terms mean to you? And I'm actually going to start over there with Kate and work around this way, if we might. So I'll draw on our own New Zealand professional education leaders' experience here. Kate, over to you.
Thank you, Derek, and kia ora. Thinking about this, success to me from a secondary environment means that our students, when they have completed their schooling and as they're moving through, are comfortable and confident in their own cultural identity, that they are able to learn, they've worked out how to learn, that they are confident about their next step, they've developed the knowledge, the skills for the next step, whatever that might be, that they have a sort of a curiosity, that they get on with other people. And as I thought about those, really what that is the vision of the New Zealand curriculum. And so it makes me feel very proud that our New Zealand curriculum does have those really deep and broad and socially important visions and goals. So that's what success means
Thanks,
to me
Kate.
from a secondary environment.
Kia ora. And maybe, I meant to mention just a quick introduction, name and where you're from, and amongst that, sorry, that was my problem there.
Sorry. Orewa College is a large year 7 to 13 school in the northern suburbs of Auckland. We have a roll of about 2,000 students, a very lovely beachside community, and I think I'm referred to in research terms as a local rather than a cosmopolitan, in that I have stayed at Orewa College for 20 years, and the school has kept changing, so I feel there's been challenges all the time, and I'm the leader of a local kahuiako, and yeah, particularly interested actually in how the whole sharing collaboration can really be valued and used to sort of improve education right across all the schools in the district.
Well said. I'm Jana Benson and I'm based at Stonefield School in Auckland. That has a roll of around 620 and continually growing. For me, success, I'm very passionate about learner agency and also assessment for learning, so students knowing where they're at, where they're going and how they're going to get there, and making sure that as teachers that we're building their learning capacity, which is one of our vision principles and foundation rocks at Stonefields.
Thank you.
I'm Eric Mazur. I'm from a small liberal arts college in the northeast of the United States. It's a pleasure to be here. As I said this morning, this is my first visit here. So, success. I think it's difficult to talk about success in some absolute sense. You sort of first need to define where you want to get, and then you can measure whether or not you get there. So I think defining your learning outcomes is probably a step you need to take before you define success. I used to teach without having really learning outcomes, just thinking, this is the content I want to cover. And then, of course, it becomes impossible to measure success. But if you use so-called backward design and you start planning, from the output end rather than the input end, and ask yourself, what are the goals I want to achieve with this course or this curriculum or this education, then you can try to measure whether or not you've accomplished this goal and define success. So that's one way to think about, success in education. Another one, but this one is much harder to measure because it takes such a long time, is to look at how successful your graduates are in their future careers. In other words, 10 years after leaving your school or your program, how are the graduates doing in society? I think there are very few places that actually engage in that types of quantitative measurement of success. But to me, in a sense, that is the true measure of success of education. How well are we preparing our students for their future careers?
Thanks. Bron.
I'm Bron Stuckey from Sydney, Australia. I'm a consultant and researcher in games learning and community, and I work in communities of practice and communities of learning. I would agree with all of what's gone before, and I think for me, working from a games environment, students who understand themselves as a learner and have aspirations as a learner is what I see as success. Who would have believed even 2 years ago that you could get a scholarship to university in esports for playing Overwatch? But you can, and there are several universities offering that. So what's success is, in academic terms, is changing. I work with schools looking at student articulation of knowledge, and that sounds like an easy space to research, and it's not. But it's such a juicy space, because how can we expect students to understand themselves as learners if we've never really listened to them articulate their learning and what they look like as a learner and how they feel as a learner? So I think students understanding themselves as a learner is what I would aspire to for success.
So, yeah, well, it is a bit here, but I think the noise. The sound's okay there. Thanks. I want to come back. There's a little slide that I've just got up there, and thank you for the responses. That from the economic unit, a report that came out just recently that was actually a major prize winner. It was awarded a great deal of money for this piece of research. So I was looking at, defining success, and there was a statement in there that I looked at. Too many governments are not doing enough to prepare millions of young people for the seismic changes in work and life. And Eric, that's kind of touches on what you raised there. And we're constantly being bombarded with this sort of statement and this sort of imperative, and yet at the school level, and many of the people in our audience there, this is something that if we take the stance that you just did, Bron, and in terms of thinking about the opportunity through games, for example, for learning, it often kind of is too big a thing, not particularly so much for the staff, but for the communities they serve and so forth. So I just wonder whether, I'd like to start with Bron and then feed off that for the other. What sort of advice have you got if the understanding of success is that kind of that bigger picture and more future focus and longer term thing? What sort of advice have you got around how we communicate the imperative that sits behind that to make learning different for our students in our schools?
Where I see that best lived is where schools are really an integral part of their community. And that's not on a transaction basis. It's where parents can come into the school when they want, when you invite parents in to give consultation on things, not as we've done in the past where we just tell parents or feed back to parents. We're not listening to them and including them. The reason parents feel threatened by new technologies or games or other things is we haven't brought them in to show them what we're doing with them, to show them the curriculum relationship. I get the age-old question, my child plays Minecraft at home, why should they be playing it at school? But if they saw what Campbell Potter was doing in his school with Minecraft, they would be blown away and would fully support using it. So we need to see our schools as more connected to the community, and that includes the businesses around us. There are lots of people who would like to mentor our students and give them a window into the working world, but we have to open up to be a community.
Sure. We live in a time of absolutely exponential change. I mean, the term "in the good old days," I think, is about 150 years old. Before that, things were changing so slowly that in a human lifespan, it was not really a big change in the way we do things. Now, in the good old days may refer to the days before smartphones, when people were actually still talking to each other during meals. Think about it. The biggest retailer now in 2017, Amazon. The biggest, if you want, public relations company, Facebook. The biggest transportation company, Uber. The biggest hotel company, Airbnb. None of these companies, or most of these companies, weren't around 10 years ago. So clearly, education has to adapt because we're no longer preparing our students for the now. We're preparing the students for a time where the world may look very different from the way it looks now. So adaptability, I think, is something that is more important now than it ever was before. And content has been completely de-emphasized because who knows what content our students will need when they enter the workplace. So I think adaptability and the ability to learn on your own, self-directed learning, I think, are probably the most crucial skills that we need to focus on in our education. Unfortunately, in most countries that I visit, I haven't looked enough in the educational practices here in New Zealand to comment on that, but in most countries there's such a focus on content and content standards that, you know, the skills that I think really matter are, you know, not really given the attention that they deserve.
So it's a good point. One of the reasons I used this as an example, and I didn't initially say it, is that this was this book here, or this publication, this research, was titled here the Worldwide Educating for the Future Index, which was addressing some of the things that you've both raised. And out of all the countries studied, New Zealand was ranked number 1, interestingly, in terms of our policy and a whole lot of other things that were looked at. And yet, on the ground, and I want to pass over to this side, so many teachers and principals and others feel the pressure of a conformity almost to something that means that they can't achieve some of the aspirations that are outlined here. You've got a comment, one of you?
Well, I think the real strength, and it's something that we continue to take for granted in New Zealand, is that because we have self-managing schools, we can actually make lots of decisions at the local level for our local community. And I agree that you need to have the community confident about what you're doing, but when you do have that confidence of the community and the trust of that community, you can be quite innovative because they trust you, you've built that trust up and you are the local school. And I think that, you know, we just constantly take for granted that other countries have a lot more central direction. We think we have. We think we've got a lot of central direction with national standards and other things like that. But we've still got way more autonomy than other schools and other jurisdictions are allowed to have.
So have you got an example, Jana, of something practical that's happening in your school context that features a sort of adaptability as an outcome that was talked about?
Well, if I look at, for example, our senior students, we have a pathways program that allows them to do some work, business exposure, some school work, some project-based working around that, so they're exposed not just to the school but to businesses, and lots of schools do these sorts of things. And you can do it fairly nimbly, and you can review it each year and change it, and you can get input from the business people. And I couldn't say that out of that comes fantastically innovative students, particularly, but certainly students with flexibility. And who knows, in the long term, who's going to be the innovative students, as you were talking about with surveying top students in schools and what becomes of them. Once students move from the school environment to what they're going to spend a bit of their next tertiary learning on, they can really, really get focused and do fantastic things that, yeah, we might not have credited them for.
It was a privilege to be a part of Carolyn's last session looking at what does a local curriculum mean for schools. And we talked about how open-ended our New Zealand curriculum is. And I suppose within our school, I think it's where does the progressions fit, or where do the national standards fit. So for us, we have our graduate learner profile, and a very big part of that is measuring all lots of different areas, and that our reading, writing and maths progressions just sit as an aspect of that graduate learner profile, and that's underpinned by our 4 vision principles. So we're looking at things like students being able to get out of the learning pit, the learner qualities, the learning process, and passions and strengths and their ability to identify those, their engagement in lessons, and all of those other things. And our professional learning for teachers is about how might they go about designing their term 4 learning. So is it going to be underpinned by, when we look at a gap analysis, by what's happening in a reading or writing or maths and the gaps in those progressions, or are we able to start looking at gaps such as within the graduate learner profile of the students being able to look at diverse perspectives and that sort of thing?
I just wanted to add, I think adaptability is vital, but creativity is equally vital. I do a lot of work in the startup community, and the idea that kids go to school and then go to work, that's out the window. Kids are starting companies at 15, inventing, innovating, designing things. So there's a parallel rather than in series life that can be happening for our learners. And Yongzhou has a quote, and I'll just paraphrase because I won't get it correct, but there's a high degree of people completing university studies in the United States who won't get a job in the field they studied in, but they won't invent a new job. They sit waiting for it to come to them. It's the creative students who will carve out the path for themselves. And to say, I want to say a word for young people. The startup groups and projects that I've worked in, young people overwhelmingly want to do good in the world. They want to create social good. So when they're in their entrepreneurial spaces and designing and innovating, they're not necessarily looking to make $1 million. They want to change the world. They want to have impact. And I think we need to create space for them to do that. That's my measure of success.
Yeah.
I'm really happy you mentioned that. I was thinking of bringing up creativity in the context of assessment. Because I think, I mean, this morning I spoke about the approach to teaching, but I think it's equally important to think about the output end. How do we measure it, and how do we assess our students? It took actually a long time for me to realize that what mattered to my students was not the way I taught them, but the way I assessed them. To the students, the assessment is the dog that wags the tail, not the other way around. In any case, I had to completely revise my assessment in order to motivate the students to study, to approach, learning the material in the right way. And I think that a lot of our assessment practices stifle creativity completely, because the road to innovation or the road to anything that's creative is littered with failures. You don't become innovative or creative without running into, failures, revisiting the failure, learning from the failure, and then improving on the process and reaching something that works better. Unfortunately, I think most assessment stigmatizes failure. Our students know, you make a mistake, you lose points, better not make a mistake. And therefore, better not take any risk. They become risk averse, and because they're risk averse, they're never going to be really creative. So we really need to rethink our approach to assessment and create space for creativity by tolerating failure and teaching students that failure, might not be the right end goal to achieve, but it's a necessary step in becoming really creative. You mentioned project work. I think that's really important, and I think it's very important to involve a component of empathy in projects. So, I teach right now, I didn't talk about it this morning, but my new course is completely project-based. And I try to add a component of empathy to the project. In other words, a way for students to either help, other people or an entity, or to do good for society. And that makes them very enthusiastic for the project. And then I tell them, here, you may want to have a look at this book in order to help you with your project. So the content becomes not an end goal in its own right, it becomes a means to achieve a goal that's more meaningful to the student.
I want to pick up on that issue of failure, because it's often said in our school system there's such an emphasis on success and getting to the point that there's not room for failure. I want to pop over to perhaps Jana. You've done a lot of thinking about learner agency, and to a lot of people learner agency is kind of letting kids go and pursue their own area of interest, but often there's a lot of fear around that in terms of they won't know the direction they're needing to go in, and B, how do you cope with them when they make too many mistakes? I mean, that's a broad question. But what's your response to that issue around failure being important?
I suppose we've got very much we're valuing that language of learning, so that all our students know about the learning pit and know that it's okay to be stuck in their learning.
Do you want to just amplify a little bit about that, because there may be people here unfamiliar with that thinking. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah,
so,
the learning pit.
So it's students embarking on work and I suppose getting stuck in and feeling that sense of failure or that they do get stuck, and what are the capabilities or qualities that they need to get out of that learning pit. And through that they might collaborate with other students, they might come and approach their teacher, they engage in the learning process. So the learning process about building their knowledge, making meaning from that knowledge and then applying their understanding, and then from that feeling that sense of success. So we have what we call breakthrough time, and that's 20% of the students' week, where they're engaging in passions or strengths of theirs, but also looking at a gap analysis and identifying what gaps they need to sort of address as well in their progressions. So, as I say, it's very much about that language of learning and what we referenced earlier, students being able to articulate. So articulate that they are getting stuck and identify what strategies they might need to use to get out of that.
Something like the reinforcing the scaffolds and things that you were talking about this morning, Eric, in your talk, and the pit being a representation, Jamie Nottingham's concept of being the hole that we can sometimes dig for ourselves and fall into in our learning, but actually having the ability to pull ourselves out, having those competencies.
Absolutely,
to do that, yeah.
And I think that that's built on every year that the students are at school, and so that, as I say, that's a language of learning across our schools, so the students are exposed to that no matter which hub or teacher they're working with, no matter which subject, and that's very big part of them being able to articulate to us.
Maybe just expand a wee bit on that too, because you've touched on that. Learning at Stonefield is a bit different from what I see in other schools when I visited there, because it's not kind of just one teacher, one class. That idea of shared and distributed ownership and experience of learning is quite different there.
Yes, yeah. So innovative learning environments or modern learning environments. So we have hubs of learners. So an example of that is we've got 3 year 4, 5 and 6 hubs. Within each of those hubs are 3 teachers. So those 3 teachers are working very collaboratively to plan the learning design and to meet the needs of students. We have an app at our school called School Talk, and that's all about planning, learning and reflecting in very open, efficient and transparent ways. And I very much say that it's not about the tool, but it's about the pedagogy that underpins that. But the learning design and all the student evidence that they upload is very transparent to any teacher. We can go into any hub, see the teacher's learning design, we can see the children who are attached to that learning, we can start to see the gap analysis that sits alongside that, so that we can start to cluster progressions or groups of students according to those progressions as well. When students are participating in learning, they are then choosing what evidence they upload, and the teachers can have a look at that and give that feedback. That also, in that paper that you referenced, Derek, it talked about algorithms working in the background when we start to use technology, yes. And that's one thing that we've just shifted, that this app is doing all our reporting for our teachers. So algorithms are working in the background saying whether the students are at the standard, and that all our reporting is also pushed out through this app called School Talk.
Cool. Did you want to add?
Just want to sort of, you mentioned the tail wagging the dog, and I guess one of the challenges that we have, and I'm hoping that with the community of learning development, as we're working more in a year 1 to 13 environment, that the sort of project-based, holistic learner approach will move up from younger primary school age children, rather than the assessment post-secondary, tertiary moving down, because I think that is actually a danger in our particular situation, with already the national standards being fairly important. And I think that in many schools, and I guess our school would be typical, we are not designed physically to allow a lot of free flow of students, teachers, in a very easy way. We have to work quite hard to make those spaces, and I think schools are doing that.
Yep.
So I think the real challenge isn't so much for schools that have been designed in a particular way for modern learning, but the vast majority of schools which haven't been designed like that, to bring in those processes and sort of have the modern learning between their ears, really, and being able to work it through physically, rather than having the physical spaces that will allow that to happen. And I also just wanted to pick up on something earlier with bringing parents involved. You know, we used to think that if parents were, 30, 35, they would kind of understand what the technology is and what their children were doing, but actually the movement is so fast now that I think we have to assume that all parents, need a bit more encouragement, really, to just come in, see how things work, and really be able to support their kids in that way, because the speed is just...
I'm hearing from all of you that quite a positive message here about the self-directedness very strongly through, and good examples from you, Jana, about how that works specifically in the school context and so forth. One of the criticisms, though, that I often face and hear is that's works so well for the kids who are able. It works well for the kids who are making progress. But I guess it kind of reminds me that one of the things that we in New Zealand context have been hit with really hard over the last 5 years is, but what about those at the other end? What about those kids who are lagging behind? I mean, is it a realistic aspiration for them to be able to come out of our education system with this? Come on, some thoughts.
Well, I mean, not everybody's equal, which is why we have this distribution over there. But I think diversity is actually good. And think about what I said this morning, right? When I started doing that, I thought, and I saw the learning gains. I thought maybe that I'm just helping those at the bottom at the expense of the students at the top, because they are the ones teaching those who are not yet understanding. And then I started to interview some students and found out that some of the better students in my class were the biggest advocates of what I was doing. And I interviewed one person who said, it stimulates the learning because you're not just at the receiving end, but also at the giving end. I had to think about what he meant by saying that. And then I realized, who is the person who learns the most in any classroom? It's the teacher, exactly. And in a sense, what I demonstrated this morning permits the better students in the class to become the teacher. So it's a win-win situation. The students at the bottom of the class go from not knowing to knowing. The ones who already know go from knowing to be able to teach somebody else. It's a win-win situation. So I think there are approaches that help, not just one slice of the population of students, but all. That would not be possible if you did not have a certain amount of diversity in the classroom. So I personally see diversity as something that is very good and that can lead to gains all over and all around.
One of my favourite quotes from one of our staff at Stonefields is saying that every child is a target student and every child's target is different. And I really like that emphasis and that idea of, are we building our students' assessment capability? So if we're truly scaffolding our students to know where they're at, where they're going and how they're going to get there, that's just a different pathway for each student. And what we were talking about before with the modern learning environments, if we focus in on that, it then doesn't matter about the beanbags or the furniture or the subject or the teacher or the walls. So it does become about students driving their own learning and having the toolkit, I suppose, to enable them to be assessment capable.
I just also think with the target, the tail that you were referring to, Derek, over the past few years, I believe that, especially here in New Zealand, that has become such a strong emphasis from our government agencies, from the Ministry, from ERO, and I suspect that it's been a good thing actually to ensure that schools really are knowing a lot about students who are not succeeding and putting in strategies, but I think that the key thing is that those students are far more identified than they would have been perhaps 8 or 9 years ago. And so we know that they are not succeeding. We perhaps don't know why they're not succeeding, and we maybe haven't quite got the strategies to lift them, but it's very clear that we're working strongly on that.
So I'm just looking at some of the questions coming in just to make sure that I acknowledge what people are saying here, and just tracking back a little, I want to use as a segue something you said, Eric, about the tail and the are you disadvantaging the upper student, the top students. And a little concern for me is what we saw in the latest OECD results for New Zealand, which illustrated that over the last 5 years we've put in enormous effort into identifying and catering for the needs of those students in the bottom end, but actually the overall impact has been a very slight rise in their educational success, but actually we've dipped overall, we've gone down, so we have actually disadvantaged some of our students. Some of the questions up here, I think, reflect that in terms of just picking up again. So I do want to come back to the panel on that issue of failure, because I think there's a critical understanding behind that about if it's important for our kids to understand how they cope with failure, and someone's worded the question, how do they fail successfully? There's a good question. I'd like some response to that with maybe some practical examples that would help inform people in the audience here.
I'm going to speak to an industry example that I think demonstrates this. I went to an event 2 years ago in Sydney called FailCon, not Comic Con, FailCon, but what it was highly successful people from Southeast Asia talking about their greatest failure. And we don't very often expose our failures. We want to laud our successes and be applauded for that. It was an intense event, and it was some of the best learning I've ever done, because these people demonstrated the things we would want for our students: resilience, grit. They were passionate about what they did and believed that they would succeed down the track, and failure was part of success. It was getting to that success. How we do that in schools is the big question. And parents don't want to hear, okay, we don't care if kids fail. That's not the right language. But we do have to make failure part of the process. There's a lot of work going on in well-being, resilience, all of that, and failure is part of that. We can't just shed it and forget that it exists. On the other end of that, I worked for a virtual world game, global game, out of Indiana University for about 10 years. And interestingly, when we first started using it in schools and tracking the academic performance of students, teachers started to say, my top achievers are not on the top anymore. And that was a bad thing. All of a sudden, a different kind of learning was appealing to other kids, and they were rising up to be in the top. School should be a smorgasbord. Not one diet, but offering for everybody. Sometimes the kids you weren't expecting are going to knock it out of the park.
Cheers. The comments.
Well, I was going to say exactly what Bron was saying. Okay. I mean, we need to talk about, we tend to hide failure, right? I mean, we only talk about our successes and don't acknowledge that success goes hand in hand with failure. Think about, Thomas Edison inventing the light bulb. I think he had something like 300 failed prototypes. Most people would have said, Tom, just go do something useful. Don't waste your time. He ended up revolutionizing the world by inventing electric light. So and in that respect, the Engineering Foundation is doing something really interesting. They publish every year what they call a failure report, and it's sort of a badge of honor to have your story printed in the failure report, where people say, well, I tried this and this is how I failed. So destigmatizing failure is, I think, is crucially important.
I guess, and I'd be interested in coming over to the other side, it leads me to thinking about how we measure achievement or success, because I think my view is we've got a very narrow view of that in a lot of what we do in our current system. And the little video clip that's referenced there is a great one where about 80 schools were explored or researched to look at what happened to their valedictorians as they left school. These are the people we hail. I think about this as I go around in my hometown of Christchurch. On the corner or outside many of the schools you go past are the pictures of those 3 or 4 students who have duxed or who have been selected for some scholarship or something. You know, and you think, what about the other 2,000 in there? You know, what's the measure of success for them? And what are those measures that we use? I'm interested to hear what are the sorts of things that happen in each of your schools or from other panellists that we should be considering as measures that we could adopt?
Well, I think there's lots of, if you like, non-curriculum measures that surround schools. And I'm thinking here arts, sports, games, any of those sorts of things. For many students and for many of their families, they see that as incredibly important. You know, whether a child's a top judo or, you know, all those sorts of things. And they, you know, they're really important because they're all learning, they're all skill-based, they're all working with other people, they're developing relationships, they're really, really important. In terms of curriculum, I guess, again, we come slightly to the tail wagging the dog sort of situation because students at the end of school are applying to universities. The universities are choosing people based on their academic performance and giving out scholarships. So there is, at this point in time, a need to identify those people who the universities would say are the most likely to make the most of their scholarships. Now, whether that's correct or not, we wouldn't know, again, as we wouldn't know until 5-10 years down the track. So I think there are lots of non-curriculum ways of measuring that, but it's rather difficult to measure curriculum ways that are not, you know, grade-based or, you know, achieving, the best.
I think I'm going to put it even more strongly than you did. I think we're actually fooling ourselves if we believe we can measure success. I can make a really long list of people who by any traditional measure were a complete failure who ended up doing up extremely well. Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg, you name it. And I can make an equally long list of people who were at the top of their class and, you know, and I don't know where they are nowadays. As, you know, as one of the members of the PhD admissions committee in my department, you know, I see for 30 positions, 900 applicants. Many of them have the most stellar transcript, and we end up making a small selection of those. And then sometimes when you meet the person in person, face to face, you realize that the transcript is not really an adequate reflection of that person's ability. And so I think our ability to actually measure success the way we're doing it now is extremely, extremely limited. And I think assessment should also be much more focused on feedback than on ranking, because I've started to not believe in any ranking anymore. Rankings typically take place along a very narrow dimension, and you know what ultimately matters in people's abilities is so broad that.
I was going to ask you if you had a practical alternative there, and the feedback is obviously a key thing. Jana, can I just get you to comment, because that's really a critical part of that system that you've got set up in your school now, isn't it? Capturing that feedback and...
Yeah, absolutely. Capturing the feedback, but also a big part for us is clustering progressions. So as I was saying, that it's not just about the reading, writing and maths progressions, but actually connecting it and showing the students the relevance to other areas. So for instance, their learner qualities, that they are collaborating, that they might be asking questions, and that we're really valuing that and reporting back on that to parents as well. So as a part of our reporting process, that parents are getting that information. A big part of as well our learning design, I suppose. And what was interesting for me at the start of the year was that there wasn't the pressure to get started with our explicit group teaching from day one. And I think there's often that pressure in our schools. And we took the first 5 weeks to just know thy learner. And what that meant for our teachers was that whether we could engage in starting to look at culturally responsive pedagogies that would meet the mark, or our priority learners and what worked for those students. And we really questioned about what does the sweet spot look for each of our students. So what is their purpose, their gifts and their passions, and looking as well at when are they engaged in learning, so that we could change our learning design throughout the year to meet the needs of those students. And then as well thinking about that we are working in very collaborative hubs and working with different teachers that can design different aspects of learning as well, so that it's not a one-size-fits-all model.
I just going to say I hold big hope for people focusing on student engaged and student articulated assessment. To cycle back to Eric's point about assessment, and I'm a research mentor to schools in Sydney working on this, and interestingly a number of game products targeted to schools are allowing students to take a snapshot of what they've done in the game, choose it as an assessment point, and then reflect on why this is a powerful point in their learning. And then give that to the teacher as their chosen point of assessment rather than a point of assessment foisted on them. And I think that's really powerful. Why shouldn't children be applauded for struggling at something and succeeding rather than we applaud the student who might have academically, raced through? For a student that's worked hard at something and been able to articulate that they conquered something huge and they're very proud of that, that should be a point of assessment for them to identify and give the teacher.
Kate, I want to come on and ask you a question on that. I mean, because it's all very well listening to Jana talk about primary school. I'm going to play devil's advocate here, right? Playing primary school about, having all that time to get to know students and do all that playway stuff. It's great in primary schools, yeah. And then to listen to this sort of thing. But secondaries are under huge pressure. You've got a lot of stuff to cover, haven't you? You've got to get through the stuff. How do you respond to that?
Well, you not only have a lot to cover, but a secondary teacher may well be teaching 150 students. That's a lot of students to develop really good relationships with. And you do have a curriculum, because the curriculum is, no matter how broad and open-ended and wonderful our New Zealand curriculum is, there are still assessments at the end of it. But I think there are, as you were saying, there's lots of ways now of using what students are doing for assessments that we perhaps haven't traditionally used. So a kapahaka for performance, for example. A presentation in front of the class or in a community forum can be actually used as assessments. Making films in a group assessments. I think there are a lot of really interesting ways that students can present material. Yep. And I think as we move further and further into using digital tools, at the moment feedback is just so much better and more constructive than it used to be when people are on something like Google Classroom, and it's ongoing, it's there, it's relevant, compared to taking in a set of books and all of that. It's
also crossing over a little bit in what Eric was talking about this morning about learning being a social engagement.
Yeah, so there's lots of really good progress. It's still, I think, us in secondary schools finding other ways of measuring and assessing perhaps the more conventional subjects. In media, in arts, it's a little easier to do that.
Okay. No, you go for it, yeah.
You mentioned, and I think we've all kind of assumed, that the measure of school success is getting to university, and I think that's up for grabs. In Sydney, and as I said, with the startup community, I see groups like General Assembly and other large training organisations bringing really exciting study to people of all ages, and it's industry-ready, career-ready, project-based. You're walking out of that with a portfolio, not a list of references to, the theorists on a subject. And so new areas of work like UX design, a whole lot of things, a university degree isn't necessarily what's valued to get into the work world. Are we assuming something that isn't necessarily true in the future?
No, I don't think so. I think quite a lot of students here are no longer choosing university as a pathway. And we've just had, was it about a week or so ago, a list of top New Zealand companies saying that they intend to recruit directly. They're not interested in the qualification. It may be that they need a qualification, but it may be they don't, and that the dispositions they've got are what is required. And, so I didn't want to give the impression that everyone's being trained to go to university. I know certainly at our school it would be fewer than 50% that do that now.
So let's hear from a university lecturer on this, a professor.
Well, I mean, you mentioned the word coverage, and
yes.
My mind started drifting here, because I think that coverage is the enemy of any curricular reform. Consider this. I told you this morning about my conversion from lecturer to sort of coach. Before I changed my approach to teaching, I covered everything. And my students did not even learn the most basic principle. Yeah. Then I switched to peer instruction, where I cover very little in the class. Yes, it's still covered by the pre-class assignment, but I do very little, and the students learn much more. Which would you rather want? So to me, what matters is not how much the instructor covers, but how much is uncovered in the brains of the students. Anyway, that's what I was thinking when you measured that. Now, in terms of whether or not we need to get everybody to go to university, I totally agree. That would be, no matter what we do, we'll end up with a bell curve, and some people will go to university, other people will go straight into the workplace. And society needs a diversity of people in a broad distribution of jobs.
Look, thanks. So I want to come to one final kind of piece of discussion, really, in that we started off thinking, what is success? And I asked you that question. And we've kind of narrowed it down to thinking about success in terms of student achievement and the conventional measures there. But when I think back about success, I think there's success as it applies to those individuals in our system, the kids, but there's also success in terms of our schools or kahuako, the clusters of schools, what makes them dynamic and successful. But there's also then just stepping back a little bit further and thinking, what makes a whole system successful? And I'm wondering, that's a big question to ask, but I'd be keen to hear from your experience as well as your insights, any response you've got to that in terms of at whichever one of those levels we use the word success, and because I've tossed in there the OECD and the Economic Development Unit's kind of view of New Zealand. That's a system view, I guess, in one way, but we have our own internal view of how our system's working as well. So what for you are some of those markers, those identifications of success at either an individual, school kahuiaka, or system level success?
I suppose in a lot of the professional learning, I always start off with Julia Aitken or Simon Sinek's why, how and what models. So before we focus on what we are doing in schools or in each individual school, is making sure that it is mutually agreed upon and well understood by all stakeholders in the community, in the kahuiako, in the school, that's parents, students, boards of trustees, that the why is really well established. So if it is learner agency or if it is changing our curriculum design, that everyone understands why. And then for each individual school, how or what they do might differ slightly, but that it is all aligned back to why we are doing it.
And speaking of Julia Aitken, Graham Aitken has just recently retired as Dean of the School of Education and Social Work at the University of Auckland, and I heard an interview he gave a couple of weeks ago, and he talks about government level in terms of education, and that we seem to be always looking at decisions as binary. We either have this or we have that. We either have standards or we don't have assessment. And he sort of regrets that he hasn't been able to influence government to say it's not an either or. It's could be all sorts of things mixed together, and we just need to be open. And I think the success of a system is that it isn't an either or, that it's constantly evolving, that it's using the input from all parties, as you say. There has to be a sort of consensus and an agreement that this is a good thing to do. And then I think it would be a great delight if we didn't have education constantly looked at as something that needs to change all the time. It does need to change all the time, but not probably at government level. That change, I think, evolves at local level, and I think that's where all the innovation actually happens.
Any other thoughts?
Well, I don't know. I think, only the future is going to be the real judge of success. And coming back to what I mentioned earlier, this exponential change, I think now we live in a time where we actually don't know what the job market will look like when the students that we're educating now will graduate. I think a few months ago I read an article in the New York Times that showed 2 paragraphs that were written, sort of telling about or recounting a baseball game the night before. One was written by a human being, the other was written by a computer. And the article said, read both paragraphs and then try to determine which one was written by the person and which one was written by an AI computer program, artificial intelligence computer program. I picked the wrong one. It's kind of an eye-opener. I could see a future, just as robots have eliminated assembly line jobs, I could see a future where machine learning and AI has eliminated jobs all across the socioeconomic spectrum. I don't know, doctors might not, or lawyers might not be needed anymore because AI can do a better job, doing that work. So maybe success is, trying to anticipate where we're going and equipping our students with the skills that are going to permit them to do well in an unknown and unforeseeable future.
So maybe success is really about understanding too that we can't use our image of the present and project that into the future as a measure for it. Yeah. Exactly. Bron, you had a comment.
I was going to say, in terms of districts, I think you touched on a key element, and that was trust. Systems in districts, trust and leadership, where you trust in the professionalism of your teachers. The conversations I've had here in 2 days, in the coffee line, the bathroom line, in the sessions everywhere, is astounding, the level of professionalism of people here. And yet our systems don't trust our teachers to make choices, and that's a trickle-down system. We need to trust students. And so, it comes to leadership and a system based on trust rather than on compliance.
So look, we've got just a moment left. I'm going to ask one question, and it's sort of a simple one-sentence answer, and that is, if there was one thing that each of you would want to see or to change, one intervention, one change, one act that could happen that might help us to be more successful in our system. If there's one piece of advice we could give government, perhaps, Kate, one thing, what might that be? What's one thing that we could do more of or better than we're not doing now that would make us more
Come
successful?
to a cross-party consensus on education and then leave it be.
And I would say perhaps to work on the culture within your school. So I think, making sure that the culture is right for questioning, for having those open conversations, to have healthy relationships where you can start to truly inquire into practice.
And embrace failure, perhaps.
Absolutely.
I'd say give up rankings, rankings both of students as well as of institutions. I mean, I don't believe in any rankings, and I think rankings do a disservice to education in general because they prevent change. Institutions as well as students are going to do whatever is necessary to do as well as possible in the rankings. So it all depends on the criteria that are established for the rankings, and those are always looking towards the past and towards the future.
And Brian.
I think it sounds like a motherhood statement, but I think to build a system that shows we trust and believe in the youth of our country is the underlying. It's the culture, it's the trust, it's all of that to show that we believe in young people, because we're doomed if we don't.
Well, look, I really sincere thanks to you. When we were running through the prep for this session, Eric looked at it and he said, "Now, what we've got 5-6 hours, because these are big issues, right?" And I'm sorry I haven't really done service to the Slido questions coming through, but hopefully that was giving you a bit of a look in the background to understand what other people are asking. This is a big system issue for us globally and in New Zealand and in our schools, is how do we understand success, and how are we going to communicate that to our students and to our parents, our community. To the panel, I think you've given us some wonderful food for thought. I love the way that your individual perspectives have contributed to a bigger picture here, but there's some pretty standard commonalities through here, and if we can achieve that, then I'm feeling good about my mokopuna as they come through the system. You know, they're going to get opportunities perhaps their parents had. So can you join with me in thanking our panel? And to all of you for participating, and you're now free. We're going down. I think we've got reception or other things happening now. So.